Hello, philosophers. Today we're looking at Greco-Roman philosophy in our very last lecture in ancient philosophy. So the time period we're looking at is from the 300s BC to the 400s or 500s CE, and that'll close out our time in this class. So there are four philosophies we'll look at today: Stoics, Epicureans, Neoplatonists, and Christian or Church Father philosophy. So we'll look at that each in turn. Now we'll start out with two philosophies that are very Greek. They had more of a Greek founding during what we call the Hellenistic age. Now, Hellenistic means Greek-like. So if you guys remember from your history class in 300s BC, Alexander the Great, Greek king, conquered big parts of Middle East and North Africa and set up this Greek-ruled kingdom and empire. And after he died, it divided into smaller Greek kingdoms. But during that time, some new philosophies were founded that became very influential. The two most influential philosophies that developed in the Hellenistic time is Stoicism and Epicureanism. There's a big question we're going to look at in these philosophies, both these two and the other two we'll look at, is how do you achieve eudaimonia? Eudaimonia, you need eudaimonia. So what is it? This is a Greek word that's very hard to translate into English, but it's often translated as happiness. But it's not just any happiness. It's not like, oh, I feel happy right now because I'm drinking a cup of tea. It's true happiness. Another word you could use is human flourishing. Eudaimonia is human flourishing, the best you can be. One of my favorite, I think, that gets across the idea fairly well is the idea of fullness. Fullness as a human being, your fullness of existence as a person. And for the Greeks, this is kind of a way of asking about what's the meaning of life. In fact, eudaimonia goes back to Aristotle and Plato as well. They would say, what is the meaning of life? What is the eudaimonia, the true purpose and fulfillment of being a human being? You might look at this as the final cause of being a human being. So as complex as all these philosophies are, we're going to focus more on this aspect of all four of these. First, starting with these two Hellenistic philosophies. So first, the Epicureans, founded by a guy named Epicurus. So very easy to remember. He was a philosopher and a thinker who founded a school in a garden. He had a garden school. Now, you might wonder, why would you live in a garden? That's interesting. Interesting context for a school. Imagine if instead of classrooms, we had gardens that we would hang out in. It's actually maybe a fairly nice idea. But his philosophy, his teaching will tell you why he did this. It'll become evident in a minute. His teaching was that the meaning of life is pleasure. Pleasure is the meaning of life for Epicurus. And another way of saying this would be that eudaimonia, or human flourishing, or happiness, or whatever, is the same as pleasure. Eudaimonia and pleasure are the same thing. He put them together. Now, for some of you might say, isn't that obvious? Like happiness and pleasure is like the same, right? Well, it's arguably not. For example, let's say you're eating ice cream. Now, as you eat the ice cream, it's sweet and you feel pleasure as you're eating this ice cream. But you might also be very depressed at the same time. You might feel sad even though you're eating ice cream and that's pleasure. So they're not necessarily the same. And Epicurus, though, said that they are the same, but at the same time, he also recognized that there are different kinds of pleasure. And only certain kinds of pleasure bring you the fullness of existence and flourishing in eudaimonia. So he said that moderation has the best results, was his argument. So he said that basically there are many different kinds of pleasures, and you have to do ones that will give you long-term pleasure. So there's short-term pleasures and long-term pleasures. There are like superficial pleasures and deeper pleasures. And he would say that, for example, if you have a box of chocolates and you're like, well, the question in my life, the meaning of life is pleasure, right? So if I'm an Epicurean, that's what I believe. So I'll say, well, what would give me the most pleasure? I think eating this box of 20 chocolates would give me the most pleasure. So you eat the whole box of chocolates. Okay, so it could be that you have a lot of pleasure while eating chocolate. You're eating it. It's just, oh, this is great. This is so much fun. But later you get sick. Being sick is not pleasurable. Okay, or you get diabetes. It's also okay. That's not so. There's bad things that happen from that. So he would say, be moderate in your pleasures. If you only eat like 2 pieces of chocolate and stretch it out over the course of 3 weeks or something, then this gives you the maximum pleasure. You have pleasure from eating the chocolate, and you don't get sick afterward. And you stretch it out, and that's a better thing. He also would say that virtue is how you achieve pleasure. So he would say that if you're, virtues, good things like honesty and courage, and these things give you pleasure as you practice them. And that should be how you achieve pleasure is through virtue. And in the way he categorized pleasures, he would also say that, okay, you get pleasure from eating, you get pleasure from drinking things, but actually the greatest pleasure are things in human relationships. So he said friendship is the greatest of all pleasures. So investing in friendships is best. Which you can see how this could work. So, I mean, the big accusation against Epicurus is that if you say the meaning of life is pleasure, people will do things that are immoral. Like you might think, I'm really angry with my brother right now. I'm going to punch him. I just want to punch him in the face. It'd be giving me so much pleasure to punch that guy in the face. And you punch him and you're happy about it. But he hates you for the rest of your life. And you have these bad feelings toward each other, and that's not pleasurable. That's not fun. Or you get thrown in prison for punching him. Also not fun. Okay. So you say that really, if you practice virtue and invest in your brother's life and are good to him and try to build a relationship with him, then that'll give you more pleasure. It might be the moment I want to punch him, but if you just put that pleasure of punching him aside and try instead to build connections with him, over the long term, you'll have much more pleasure than if you had punched him. That's what he taught. However, over time, many people didn't like that patience. They said, actually, if the meaning of life is pleasure, I think the best thing is simply to have a lot of pleasure at once. So this hedonism. Hedon just means it's a Greek word for pleasure, but people who pursued pleasure and sought it very actively were called hedonists. And sometimes they would pursue it in very kind of weird ways. Like some of the Romans especially, they would say, I'm just going to eat at a party because I love eating and this food's really good. It's really tasty. They get full and they'd be like, oh, I'm full. I can't eat anymore. But I want more. I want to have more pleasure with eating. So they make themselves throw up. And then their stomach is empty and they start eating more again. That's the kind of things they would do. And this got a bad reputation. All the other philosophies kind of didn't like Epicureans because they thought it could be misused in this way. So anyway, that's what he said. Meaning of life is pleasure. The Stoics now. Stoics is another philosophy founded in founded by Zeno of Citium, 300 BC. And give you some context to this. One thing about the Hellenistic period in this time is that life was very unpredictable sometimes. You would often have people who had a friendship with a Greek king, or they're a Roman senator, or they're in some political alliance, or even they're say an artist and they make art for a king or some patron, the patron of a king. But let's say the king loses a battle and everyone who was his friend is now in prison. So you're stuck in prison, or you're going to die, you'll be executed. So the question for the Stoics is, how do you achieve eudaimonia? How do you achieve human fullness when things don't go right, when you're in prison? That's the kind of thing they were looking at. So they'll give you some context here. Now, Zeno's books didn't really survive directly, but his Stoicism is survived through other later writers. So in the first century CE, Seneca and Epictetus wrote books about Stoic philosophy. And they still exist today. Actually, you can get, there's a copy of Epictetus, his Discourses, which you can read. I read it. It's a pretty simple read. It's good. Also, another one is, the thing about Epictetus is interesting. He was a slave for a while. And he got his freedom and ended up becoming a philosopher who founded his own school. So he's a kind of a inspiring story, from slave to founder of a school, philosopher. Some guys that were not actually professionals. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, actually, in the 2nd century CE. And he wrote a book called Meditations, which you can buy today. Basically, it's a personal journal of his own personal journal. And it's also a good source for Stoic philosophy, for what they believed, what they taught. Anyway, so what did they teach? Let me explain this. Stoics said that the meaning of life is to use reason to live in accordance with nature, to follow virtue. That's what they believe. So using reason to live in the way that nature says. They would say that nature has ordained that certain things happen in the world, and you should follow that. And they said that virtue is the way. So nature has set up virtue as something that human beings can do. Things like honesty and courage are things that you should do. So it's reasonable to do those things, and that's how you should live your life. Just be good, follow reason. In fact, I would say that nature itself is a follower of reason. You can almost say that reason, it's almost like reason was almost like a god to them, like one of the gods. The Greek word actually is logos. It meant the rational principle that held the world, the universe together. And this gets us to a teaching that's pretty important to their philosophy, and that is the idea of fate, like destiny. So they would say that the universe, following logos, or following the rational principle of things, makes certain things to happen. So if it doesn't rain on your crops and you don't have enough food to feed your family, that's sad, but it's just fate. That's just how the universe works. And for some reason unknown to you, it just happened that way. Or if your king loses a battle and you're thrown in prison, well, it seems like fate just had to be that way. It was inevitable that should happen. This gets us into something pretty important in their philosophy. They divided things into what you can control and what you can't control. So to say that what you can control is your emotions and your feelings and your own personal reason. What you can't control is fate. Nature or fate just does things and you can't control it, so don't try. If something happens and you can't really control this thing, then why worry about it? They would also divide things into 3 bits. They would say there's good, there's evil, and there's things that are indifferent or neutral. So they'd say, well, some things are good, they're morally good. So if you're courageous, that's good. Try to be courageous. You can control that, so be courageous. Cowardice is evil. Being a coward is evil. Don't do that. Be courageous instead. And you pursue those things. And if people do things good to you, then that's great. If people do things evil to you, well, that's too bad. And you can say that's evil, but that's just the way it is. You just accept it. Indifferent, though, these are things that are neutral. So they would say, if it doesn't rain, or if your king is killed in battle, well, it's not really evil or good. It just happened that way, and it's neutral. So they would say, don't be upset about things that are indifferent. If you get sick, for example, that'd be something indifferent. So if you get sick, well, that happens sometimes. It's indifferent. It's not evil. It's not morally evil. It's just indifferent. It's just neutral. So don't worry about it. I keep saying don't be upset, don't worry about it. That's because the Stoics said that passions are dangerous. They say that passions, our emotions, can get out of control and make us very upset. And if you're upset or sad or angry, you're not experiencing eudaimonia. You're not experiencing fullness or happiness. So they say control your passions. And the way to control your passions is to say, well, if you're feeling passionate or upset about something, what is the thing you're upset about? Well, my king lost a battle and now I'm in jail. Well, can you control that? No, I can't. So accept it. But what can you control? Well, I can control my passions. I have reason. I can control what I feel. So do that. Just control your passions. Be calm about this thing and don't worry about it. That way you can achieve happiness and fullness even in prison like that. One good way of explaining this is this quote from Epictetus. He said, I must die. But must I die bawling? Must I die crying? My eyes out. So that basically encapsulates Stoic teaching. So I must die. This is something that fate has ordained. And it's something that you can't control. Everybody dies. So maybe you're like upset saying, oh, I'm really worried about dying, or maybe you're about to be executed, or maybe you're just like, I'm worried that someday I will die. Everyone dies. Well, everyone dies. That's nature. It's just how it is. Accept it. There's the second part of what he says, but must I die bawling? The idea is, well, what I can control is how I feel about my death. So why not just be okay with it, accept it, control my passions, follow reason, follow virtue, and not be crying, carrying on. There's an example of this. I mean, if you're watching a movie, and let's say there's two guys who are handcuffed in some action. I like to watch action movies, like this kind of stuff. So there might be two guys handcuffed, and they're about to be executed. And one of them is like crying and weeping and begging, saying, please, please, please. And he's falling on the ground, rolling around. Okay, he's going to be executed, but do you have to do that? Like, maybe there's a better way to meet your death than that. And the other guy, let's say he's like sitting up very straight. He looks the guy with a gun in the eye saying, go ahead and shoot me. Well, he'd be a Stoic. He'd be someone who's meeting his death, but using bravery and the virtue of courage as he meets it. And that's what the Stoics are trying to look for. So here's a comic, explains that. Dead, but so what? He accepts it. He's a Stoic. Now, when the Hellenistic period ends, you guys know from history that the Romans conquered the Greek kingdoms later. And basically, even though the Romans conquered the Greeks, you could say the Greek philosophy conquered the Romans. Romans loved Greek philosophy, and they adopted in the 1st century BC and also the 1st century CE. Epicurean and Stoic philosophy became part of the Roman world, a lot of Roman ideas. They accepted it. And many schools were founded all across the Roman Empire that taught these philosophies. Also, another new philosophy was formed, you could say, and that is Christianity. So in about 30 CE in Roman Palestine, this area, Jesus of Nazareth began a new movement that spread over time all across the Roman Empire. And between Christianity and a new philosophy that's also old called Platonism, you had a change in the Roman philosophical world. So by the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century CE, Stoic and Epicurean philosophy actually declined, and a new one came to be called Neoplatonism. Now, Neoplatonism just means new Platonism. It's like a new version of Platonism. And a good example of this is a guy named Plotinus. Plotinus was a major philosopher in Rome who taught a new form of Platonism. And Neoplatonism, I have to say, is very complicated. So I'm going to try to give you some basics. If you don't understand it completely, that's okay. I don't really know if anybody does, but I'll try to give it an attempt. The teachings are Platonist. So you guys already know what this is. This is easy, right? So Plato believed that there are things on the earth are copies of ideal forms. There are forms, ideas out there somewhere of animals and people and courage and whatever, and that these ideals out here are the real thing, and then the things on the earth are like copies of the ideals, of the ideal forms. So they basically believed that. But they went further with it. So one thing they would say is that they put the ideal forms, where are these things? They would say that they exist in the one, or in the good. So I have a chart here which would take me 2 hours to explain. These are so complex. Anyway, I want to show this to you to say that they would see the one, or the good, as being like the original source, almost like God. You could say that it's like God, you could say. That it's in the middle, and it would say you have the one, or good, and out of this you have an emanation of different things in the world. So out of the one comes the world and physicality and all these things. And they would say that within a human being, there's a divine spark that somehow a little piece of the one, or the good, or whatever you call it, is in the human being themselves. And they would say that basically the meaning of life is for a person to unify with the good through the use of intelligence. So they would say the divine spark in a person, and intelligence, or reason you might say, are good in that by seeking reason, seeking intelligence, and the divine spark within, you can unify with the good when you die. Well, kind of in this life also, you kind of have a mystical experience with the one, which, I mean, that's outside of my explanation, but you can somehow experience something good by connecting your divine spark with the one that's out there somewhere, kind of rising above your body. And they'll say that virtues help with that. They would say by doing, because they called it the good actually, so good is a virtue. So things like honesty and courage and kindness, these are virtues that help you rise to unify with the one someday. That's Neoplatonism. It became very popular in the 2nd, 3rd centuries CE. One good quote from Plotinus says, bring the God in us, the divine of the all. So there's like a piece of God in us, and if we connect with the all or the one or the good, that is the meaning of life. That's what you want. So Neoplatonism, now they came into contact a lot with Christianity. So by this time, by the 200s, 300s, and 400s CE, Christianity had spread a great deal, and many very intelligent people who were literate and were philosophers became Christians. And this became a philosophy in its own right. Now, these guys who would write about Christian teaching and philosophy were called church fathers. There's a lot of these guys, Origen and Irenaeus and many others. I won't name them all. I think there's over 100 of them. They would write and talk about Christian teaching, defend it, explain it, that kind of thing. The most famous one I'll talk about now is St. Augustine. Augustine is considered one of the great philosophers. On many people's top 10 philosophers list, Augustine would be on it. That's why I'll put him as the main example of this. Augustine is an interesting character. He was dabbling in different philosophies in his early years and kind of was a seeker of truth, you could say, or this dabble in this philosophy, that one. He was a teacher. He'd move around. At the age of 32, though, he converted to Christianity. And this completely changed his life. And he saw Christianity as a way of explaining eudaimonia, explaining the philosophies that he had been involved with before. Good source for this, with some books here. This is his book called The Confessions. The Confessions is a book, kind of his story of how he came to his philosophy of Christianity. So I'll explain this a bit. Now, what he did is he focused on human desire a lot. He said, look, we have to begin with desire. He says people desire things. And people's desires move them in certain directions. People desire lots. They desire food, they desire fame and success. There's all these things that people desire. And Augustine said humans are created for desire. They're desiring beings, and they love things. They love people, they love things. They're made to love. And so what we have to figure out then is, how do you handle these desires? Because one thing he said about philosophy is that people will say that virtue is good, but they don't actually follow it. They desire to be courageous on the battlefield, but they also, if they're on the battlefield of fighting, they might have two desires. They might be like, I want to be courageous, but I also want to be alive, and I'm afraid I'll die if I stay here. So they'll run away, they'll be a coward. And Augustine says, well, how do you solve that problem of your desires seem to be divided? How do you handle that? And he said that the issue is misdirected or evil desires. He said that you have these evil desires within, and that these things are directing you into different directions. So people desire success, or they desire being rich, or they desire to have pleasure, or whatever it is they desire. And these often misdirect them to bad ends, where they end up being miserable, or they end up doing something evil, even though they originally wanted to do something good. They end up doing evil. How does that work? Well, Augustine answered this problem that he articulated by saying that we need to be unified with the Creator, with God. His argument goes that the Creator is the greatest good. The Creator who made all goods, things that people enjoy, like food and good things and wealth and beauty and all these things, come from the God who made it all. So he would say that only the Creator then can bring the greatest good to satisfy people's desires. Only a creator could direct people's desires in the way that they should go, toward God. So, and therefore, what he would say the meaning of life is, the meaning of life, or eudaimonia, is found in knowing and loving God. Quote from Augustine, he says, happy is the one who has God. If you have God, you can be happy no matter what circumstance you're in. So he's kind of dialoguing with Neoplatonists, with the idea of union with God. He's also dialoguing with Stoics by saying that, even in prison or when miserable things are happening to you, you can still be happy because you have God. Now, how do you have God? Is a quick question. Now, this is where a lot of Augustine's Christian background comes in. So he would say that basically that what's necessary is conversion. So here he kind of builds off the New Testament and teachings from the Christian Bible, which teaches that God, because humans have evil desires and can't desire rightly by themselves, that God became a human being in the form of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ, he taught the true teaching, and then suffered and died sacrificially for people, for humanity, so that he's sort of paying. You could say he pays for the crimes people commit with their evil desires and misdirected desires, so that people can know God and have an open access and a relationship with God through what Jesus Christ did for them. So one way of kind of summarizing this is a quote from the Confessions, where this is sort of a prayer. You could say in this prayer he says, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. So there's kind of this idea that people are made for a relationship with God, and if people don't have a connection with God, their heart is restless. They're wandering around, following one desire after another, because their true desire, the one they're really made for, is to know God and be known by God. He says once someone finds God, it can rest in God as an experience. So those are the main ideas of Augustine's philosophy. So wrapping up with these four philosophies, we've looked at this question: how do you achieve eudaimonia? How do you achieve true happiness, flourishing, and fullness? How do you find the meaning of life? How do you live life? And we have four different answers from these four philosophies. So Epicureans say the meaning of life is pleasure. Stoics say the meaning of life is following virtue through the use of your reason and calmness. Neoplatonists said the meaning of life is to unify your divine spark within with the one in some mystical way. And Augustine said the meaning of life is to know and love God and be known and be loved by God. So four different answers to this question. They have some overlap, but also they're pretty different in some other ways. And I hope this lecture has helped you think about this question of wisdom. So over the course of this class, we've looked at wisdom and how ancient philosophy is trying to say, how do we use knowledge and apply it practically to how we live our lives? And you guys being young and being in school, how you live your life, the meaning of life is something that's very important to you, and kind of what you think now will help you on your journey in life. So I'm hoping that kind of realizing some of the ancient wisdom, the ancient philosophies of how they approach these things can help you yourselves in answering this question. And this wraps things up. So I look forward to hearing your responses to this. And I can say, guys, I really enjoyed teaching you and discussing these things with you. And I wish you all the best for your school and for your summer.